This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
Late on Wednesday, a news story broke on Twitter while I was out running errands in the city with the family, and that the story is this, that the U.S. government's most high-profile and probably corrupt investigative force has been keeping an eye on traditional Catholic media outlets and traditional Catholics more broadly. The memo that was leaked online didn't mention individuals, but it did mention Catholic media and advocacy organizations that in reality are only guilty of rejecting the agenda of Moloch and Satan in the culture, and not all the things the memo says. But that is by itself enough now in our time to earn you the ire of the government. But the story also mentions the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, the FSSP, Sedevacantists, and it makes no distinction between any of them. And why should they? All of those organizations are actually Catholic. They actually have the Catholic belief that Catholicism, real traditional Catholicism, should transform the culture and the society. And because of that great crime, traditional Catholics are now being monitored by the government for a bunch of things that have nothing to do with the faith and aren't even true. Now, this story dovetails nicely with the oddly concerted effort against conservative and traditional Catholics that we've been witnessing. While he's not a traditionalist per se, just ask Tim Gordon about that. And he's, again, not a radical traditional Catholic. But he is guilty of much the same thing that lies behind the details you're about to hear. So pay close attention to how the government views traditional Catholics in the story. They don't actually care about which group of priests you feel loyal to or not, or the internal politics between the FSSP and the SSPX. They don't care about irregular canonical statuses or any of the rest of that. Bear that in mind. Headline from LifeSite. FBI whistleblower releases documents showing agency is surveilling, quote, radical Latin Mass Catholics. The memo cites a 2021 study from a notorious anti-Catholic group that our hosts protect at all costs here on YouTube to justify the FBI's monitoring efforts. Yes, probably every one of the actually traditional Catholic voices you like are being monitored and watched in some way. This story is delaying a video that I had planned for today about other things going on, but I'll have that for you tomorrow probably. And I would honestly bet that Francis and the government are working hand in hand on this monitoring operation. It would only make sense if they did work together in some way, if there was cooperation. For the Vatican, trads, traditional Catholics, radical traditional Catholics, represent a return to the way things were before the Council. The government, the resurgence of traditional Catholicism, is rooted in the same hatred for our faith that lies at the very foundation of the United States, and now manifests itself in the opening, embracing of, and promotion of the sins that cry out to heaven for justice by our government. And that animosity towards our faith goes all the way back to the founding. It really does, if you know anything about the history of this country. But some names are on the list of organizations being monitored. This list represents the who's who of Catholic media groups. If an organization didn't make the list, then you have to assume that the government approves of them. And again, they don't mention individuals by name, which is probably wise on their part because that would cause a bigger firestorm for them than they already have. But remember that because the government is using the typical excuse. Traditional Catholics allegedly make common cause with various boogeyman organizations that don't even really exist anymore, that the government was worried about back in 2016 and all through the previous presidency. We haven't heard much from those groups because they're so worried about because they're trotting it out again. And those groups don't even exist anyway, but they're trotting all this nonsense out again just in time for the 2024 contest. The story centers around an internal memo leaked from the Virginia office that was never meant to be made public. It was actually leaked by a Protestant, apparently, who wanted nothing to do with this stuff. It has a title full of flag terms on YouTube, so we'll just have to refrain, but it links traditionalists with those from the same perceived ethnic group as the majority population in the U.S., who are, the little fringe elements of it within it who are obsessed with the appearance of the flesh, to put it in weird but vague enough terms, but I think you know what I mean. Anyway, let's get to the LifeSite article. Quote, in general, the report shows an above-average understanding of the various pro-Latin Mass communities in the Church, including the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, the Priestly Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX quote-unquote resistance, as well as Sedevacantist groups. It notes that the FSSP and SSPX have, quote, houses of worship in the Richmond area. As an aside, it notes that the SSPV don't. But anyway. It also says other FBI investigations, local law enforcement reports, and unnamed liaisons have helped compile its findings. an indication that persons familiar with these communities have been in touch with intelligence officials. FBI Richmond relied on the key assumption that groups motivated by the appearance of the flesh and with bad tendencies will continue to find radical traditionalist Catholic ideology attractive, and will continue to attempt to connect with RTC adherents, both via social media and in person at places of worship. It reads, the report further states that there now exist, quote, new opportunities for threat mitigation through the exploration of new avenues for tripwire and source development. The document then compares followers of RTC ideology to ordinary traditional Catholics who simply prefer the Latin Mass and pre-Vatican II teachings and traditions, but without the more extremist ideological beliefs and violent rhetoric, end quote. And they use the old Crusader memes, the guy with the sword and all that stuff. That's what they're talking about, by the way. But in other words, if you somehow do the mental gymnastics as a Catholic and want pre-Vatican II teachings and traditions, but don't take the next step and let that inform your worldview and influence your political and social thinking, then apparently you're okay. If you do go to the next logical step, because it's an inevitable logical step, and let it inform those things, then you're the part of the problem. They'll just accuse you of a bunch of stupid nonsense in order to justify what they're doing. But if you accept classical liberalism, which is a formally condemned ideology by the Church in various preconciliar documents, including one by Leo XIII called Libertas, that I have on this channel, that got a lot of pushback when I put that up. If you accept those ideologies as being erroneous, but not as bad as the hammer and sickle ideology, which is what the Church says, then you're part of the problem. Behind all of their language on the flesh and ethnicity and the rest lies the truth. And that is what they're concerned with. They just use the language of animosity and not liking people and the appearance of the flesh to mask it. But it gets better. Here's the group of Catholic media organizations they're worried about. Consider this an endorsement from the enemies of Christ. Quote, the memo identifies 9 traditional Catholic organizations allegedly guilty of promoting RTC ideology. Catholic Family News, The Remnant, the Fatima Center, Tradition in Action, the Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Brother Andre Marie's organization, Culture Wars, In the Spirit of Charts, Christ or Chaos, and Catholic Apologetics International. These groups were all listed in the organization's report, end quote. And I'm happy to tell you that I have been writing an article about once a month for Catholic Family News since last summer. If you haven't read them, go join Catholic Family News and you can. But imagine it, the Fatima Center, the Remnant. I mean, Michael Matt is pretty normal politics and never gets into those issues of the appearance of the flesh that these people are so worried about. He's not a person who hates anyone based on stupid things like that. Catholic Family News laughably stands against what the government says and reminds their readers in a statement by Dr. Brian McCall that the groups the agency is so worried about have a history of opposing everything Catholic and making lives miserable for Catholics right alongside all the other groups in the culture that those groups that they claim traditional Catholics are allying with. It's completely illogical that they would go from actively and violently opposing our faith and its influence in the culture to standing with it and working with it. It's on its face absurd. It's silly. It's stupid, but they know people will believe it. Not to mention that these groups they so worry about functionally don't exist in America anymore. They don't. The tyrants still need their boogeymen to make the average American jump in fear. And now they have their boogeyman. So, 2 years ago, I was on a live stream with a friend who long since decided to get out of the Catholic YouTube game. It was on his channel, which is now gone. But on that stream on his now defunct channel, he and I talked about how we expected this very thing to happen. And you know what? It's going to get worse. This friend of mine and I predicted that things will probably culminate in St. Mary's, Kansas, which is the home of the SSPX in the United States, where they're building that enormous, gorgeous, Immaculata, cathedral-looking, essentially parish. That we expect that to be the next Waco. That's the rhetoric the memo uses anyway. It lumps the SSPX and FSSP, Sedevacantists, SSPX Resistance, some Sedevacantists groups by name, all into one boat and uses the same label for traditional priestly groups and the laity that go with them as the government did in Texas in the 1990s leading up to that other event. Notice no conservative Catholic media groups who go after traditionalists are listed, by the way. Take note of that. Those who stridently oppose traditional Catholicism and rad trads and go after us with their full force and venom of their platforms are getting the seal of approval from the enemies of Christ. That's worth remembering the next time they make stupid allegations about one priestly fraternity or another. And also, at least at the time of the production of this episode, Rome has been silent and has said nothing. They're probably working with them on this, to be honest with you. In fact, the only bishop to speak against this has been Bishop Strickland, which isn't surprising. The rest have kept their heads down and their mouths shut. That's probably because most of them agree with the government report, or because most of them have too much federal money involved in their dioceses through some really problematic Catholic nonprofit organizations to be willing to risk speaking the truth now. Don't take the government's word for this. Of course, if you're sort of new to all this, don't take the government's word about it. This isn't about groups obsessed with the appearance of the flesh and skin tone. There's so little of that concern among traditional Catholics in America that it's a laughable charge. What they are concerned with is the underlying values. That traditional Catholics believe that the faith should transform the culture. Mainstream Catholics, conservative or not, are fine to go along with the political culture of America. This has been celebrated by those on both the left and the right openly. I once saw Ann Coulter celebrate that. That Catholics no longer believe that the faith should transform society. Traditional Catholics do believe that, and believe that the handful of accepted political ideologies in America are bankrupt at best, or outright evil at worst. That's the crux of the problem here. That's the real problem, and it goes all the way back to the founding of America. It's in the Declaration of Independence. Go back to the Declaration of Independence. Go read that reference to Quebec in there. That's what that's about. This was all inevitable. It really was. And what comes next as a consequence is anyone's guess. But I'm curious, though, what do you think comes next as a result? Is this all a bunch of nothing? Are we all worrying about something that's not that big a deal? Should we expect more Mark Houcks, except probably including traditional Catholic voices? Let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot, too. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.